It's July 5th, 2015. We are in Leeds, Alabama, a suburb of Birmingham. In an area referred to as a playground, where people tend to go to party and ride their ATVs. This particular day, the rider sees something that looks out of place. Something different than anything she's ever seen. She realizes she's looking at a dead body. And so it begins.
I'm Kevin Palmer. When I was really young, my father was a deputy sheriff. I remember the star badge that he would have laying on the dresser. That kind of sparked my interest a little bit as a young kid. I started in law enforcement in 1997, and by 2015, I was the lead detective at the Leeds Police Department. Investigations for me has always been the most exciting part. It's a cat and mouse game. It's an adrenaline rush. The evening of July 5th, I was getting ready to go out to dinner with my wife.
Detective Palmer.
I got a call about a burned body in a pile of debris. And so I told my wife, this is what I need to do to help my fellow coworkers because I knew that they needed some assistance out there.
It's a constant problem when you're a detective. Your personal life goes out the window whenever the phone rings. I would interview people before they came into Homicide, and I would say, don't ever tell me you're tired. Don't ever tell me you're hungry. Don't ever tell me you have to go home and see your wife. If I thought you needed a wife, I would issue you one. You have to be dedicated, and Palmer is dedicated.
The Marquita Playground is owned by a railroad company. It was private property. However, they didn't really enforce trespassing too much. Because of the 4th of July weekend, the playground was not the best location for evidence gathering. This was an area where people would go out there drinking. There were broken bottle pieces and just various trash.
There are tire tracks everywhere. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of expended casings.
People would discharge firearms, shooting at bottles and other things.
There's an enormous amount of potential evidence that could be absolutely meaningless.
Myself and my crime scene technician started approaching the pile.
Even before I walked up to the pile, you could just smell that smell, a very distinct smell that really does not smell like anything else.
No one can communicate the odor of burning flesh. It has a sickly, sweet smell. Once you've smelled it, you'll never forget it.
What stood out to me on the pile was the frame of a couch. As I'm seeing this, I can make out that there is a human arm that's outreached from the pile. And once we pulled back that furniture piece, we could tell that there was a human body on this pile of burned debris.
The facial features are gone, burned away.
I could not determine race, sex, age. It looked like something you would see in a horror film.
I have never seen a body that destroyed.
What could possibly have happened that you would do that to another human being?
someone put this person here? Whether or not they killed him was the question.
What if somebody's there, they take drugs, and they die, and it's an overdose? Their friends decide out of panic, we'll just destroy the body, and no one will ever know.
My first assumption was it was just a drug deal that went bad. In the Leeds area, most crime revolves around drugs.
It didn't appear there was anything useful at the scene that would tell me who this was or who was involved. It weighs in the back of my mind, am I going to be able to figure out what happened?
The body is then removed and sent to the morgue for subsequent examination. Two things happened of significance during the autopsy. The largest bone in the human body is the femur. It joins the hip to the knee. The femur was shattered by a large caliber bullet, an entry-exit gunshot wound. No slug was recovered. Secondly, another complication.
The autopsy report also indicated that there was a high level of methamphetamines in his system.
Because of the fire, it was impossible for the coroner to say whether or not the methamphetamines were at a fatal level. So now we have two possibilities. Drugs killed him, or a gunshot wound to the leg killed him. It doesn't take long to bleed to death. Humans are fragile. They break easily.
From that point, our goal is to find out, number one, who this person is.
You must identify him before the investigation can even begin.
We started putting our heads together, thinking about who this could be. There's a young man that we would deal with from time to time.
There's a local drug dealer and user named Don Whitestone.
It wouldn't be shocking to us if he was our victim. Maybe a drug transaction that had gone bad. But I discovered that he actually is in the Jefferson County Jail on some unrelated charges.
He's alive and well, so it's not him.
A lot of times what it's going to be is reaching out, going through the database to see have there been any missing person reports in the past 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, however long we want to go back. We got a call back from the coroner's office. The coroner was able to run fingerprints from the victim's hand that was not burned badly, and they identified the victim as Anthony Gibson. He's 20 years old.
Anthony Gibson has been missing for several days. Who knows Anthony Gibson? And how does he happen to be in this fire pit? We have the first piece of this jigsaw puzzle. Now let's see if we can solve this thing.
The weekend of July 4th in 2015, a body was found in a pile of burned debris. The body was badly damaged, but we later discovered it was Anthony Gibson, who's 20 years old.
Anthony Gibson was reported missing 3 days before he was discovered in the fire pit. Last seen driving Grandma's car, a small, white, compact car.
So I reached out to Anthony's grandmother, Kathy.
And so we met at the Huddle House in Chelsea.
So I'm just going to ask you a couple questions.
I don't divulge to her right away that I know that Anthony is the victim. I'm really just trying to get to know Anthony a little bit better.
Anthony was born in Panama City, Florida. Me and Anthony's mom split up when he was 9 months old.
Anthony and his dad were best friends. He loves his dad. Him and his grandmother were really close. They all lived together, so he was very tight-knit with his family.
Anthony was a really good person. He was the type of person that would take his shirt off his back for anybody.
His personality literally would light up a whole room. His laugh was so contagious. He had a way of making you feel included and welcomed and just loved and cared for.
Anthony had lots of friends. He loved to play the guitar.
He learned to play through church and just picked it right up. He was an inspiration.
Anthony worked with all of us in family business. We did vinyl siding, metal roofs, put windows in. He loved to work, loved making money.
He wanted to be his own boss, and the way to do that was to own your own business. And because he worked full-time, he took on online schooling to get his degree.
He had a lot of dreams, and all of that was just put to a screeching halt.
Tell me about the night he disappeared.
He had been doing some schoolwork, and I was sitting in the kitchen. He came in there and told me that he was going to go to the store and get something to snack on.
And he never came back.
We're trying to call him and started getting more worried because he's never not answering me calling.
The family was pretty adamant that he didn't just take off, that it wasn't his personality.
Something is wrong, something has happened.
We were putting out that he was missing. Everybody was sharing it, putting it on Facebook.
They had been searching for Anthony for quite some time with no results.
Did Anthony have any type of drug issues that you're aware of?
I knew he had used here and there, but he paid his bills. He showed up for work every day. I mean, I wasn't really worried about him doing it, but I didn't want him doing it.
Was he dating anybody?
Anthony was very handsome. I don't remember a time that he didn't have a girlfriend.
He had this on-again, off-again girlfriend named Jessica.
Typically, when you have a murder investigation, if there's a significant other, that person is going to be a prime suspect. At that point, I unfortunately have to tell Miss Lee that the body that we found in Leeds is her grandson, Anthony. It's just very heartbreaking.
I just felt like I needed to scream, but at the same time, I needed to get on the phone and I needed to call Shane and tell him to come to the Huddle House.
I got there and I lost it. Just hit the ground crying. I lost a piece of me. I mean, the only way I really know how to explain it. Worst feeling I ever had.
I was sick to my stomach. I remember we all just stood outside and just held each other. It was awful. It was literally one of the worst times of my entire life. It was terrible.
Palmer knows that Jessica could be the key to unlocking the mystery of the death of Anthony Gibson.
I decided to meet Jessica while she's at work. She was working for a local fast food restaurant.
When was the last time you spoke with Anthony?
The night he disappeared.
Jessica and Anthony were going to meet at a Walmart parking lot.
Right across the street from my job.
On that night, July 2nd, she got her break.
And Anthony never shows. She's just very confused.
She said she waited and then she went back to work. Palmer checks with her manager at the fast food place. Jessica is not at the playground burning Anthony Gibson's body. She's at work where she's supposed to be. So we're back to the beginning. Now what? You put it aside, you forget it, it's gone. Okay, this didn't work. Let's find something that is going to work. So Palmer decides to request Anthony's cell phone records, including his text messages. But he knows that will take some time to retrieve. So he reaches back out to Anthony's grandmother.
I call Anthony's grandmother, Miss Kathy Lee. And I ask her about Anthony's cell phone records because she actually is the owner of the cell phone.
He could see the last call that Anthony had on the phone.
I started doing some phone calls, reverse searches of it. And what's remarkable to me is that the phone number comes back to a young man that I know very well.
The last number he called was none other than the charming Don Whitestone, Palmer's nemesis, who he knows is a drug dealer. But Whitestone's in jail. You can't have your phone in jail. Who's got Whitestone's phone?
I decided to call the phone number.
Hello?
The person on the other end of the line is a female.
She says her name is Candy Zito. Hello, Candy Zito. Why do you have Whitestone's phone? Well, we're boyfriend and girlfriend, and when he went to jail, he gave me the phone.
Did you by any chance happen to talk to Anthony Gibson the other night?
Anthony?
Candy tells me that she does know Anthony, that they had dated sometime in the past, but she has not spoken to him in quite some time.
I'm sorry, sir. I wish I could help you, but I gotta go.
She seems to be trying to get me off the phone quickly, and I don't really get the impression that she's being very truthful.
Palmer thinks about it. What if Mr. Gibson makes that call to score some drugs, expecting to encounter Mr. Whitestone, and instead he encounters Candy Zito? Maybe. Palmer, like all good detectives, has informants he develops over time. He reaches out to his most trusted informant. After doing some digging, the informant calls and says, "I've got a scoop on your dead guy, Anthony Gibson." Oh, pray tell.
All right, today is July the 8th. This is Detective Palmer, Leeds Police Department. He's telling me that there are two individuals that could be involved with Anthony Gibson's death.
The word on the street is that they weren't happy with Anthony Gibson. Oh, really? Well, why might that be? Let's find out.
It's my understanding that you have some information you want to tell me about Anthony Gibson.
Yes, sir.
He believes that there are two individuals that could be involved with Anthony Gibson's death.
Jerry Lipinski and his buddy, Jesse Clemens.
Okay. And what is the connection with Anthony?
Well, he said Jerry and Anthony Gibson were dating the same woman. Who's that? Well, it's Candy Zito. That's a familiar name. The same Candy Zito that's been dating Palmer's drug dealer's nemesis, Don Whitestone. She's been a busy girl.
He's been in jail multiple times. He does have a record of beating on females.
Okay.
Anthony does have a past history, taking up females.
What if Candy Zito is getting slapped around by her boyfriend and she calls Anthony Gibson for help?
If Anthony took up for her while he was there, I would not put it past him. He's always threatening to kill people.
Okay, so we're guessing that possibly Anthony was taking up for Candy.
Yes, sir.
Is that a reason to kill? Sure it is. Affairs of the heart can be a very powerful motive. Is Jerry Lipinski and his associate Jesse Clemens? That is the question.
I start looking into the two of them, and I find that they were no stranger to the criminal justice system.
They are serious players. They have extensive criminal histories and are currently wanted on warrants.
Being that they're felony warrants, I was able to reach out to the U.S. Marshal Task Force and put locates on both those subjects. Upon the discovery that he and Candy might have had some involvement together, there was speculation that Candy might know where I can find this guy.
There's all this activity rotating around Candy Zito. How is she connected to this?
Hello?
Hey, Candy, it's Detective Palmer again.
Yeah?
I'm basically trying to convince her to come talk to me at the office. And she's telling me that I have nothing to tell you.
I don't know anything about this. Stop calling me.
And she says, this is the sound of me throwing the phone out the window.
Hello? Candy, hello?
Well, Candy, it seems like we touched a nerve, didn't we?
This is the moment that, a detective, looks forward to, that aha moment. Is like, I think I've got something here.
She's up to her neck in this, somehow or some way. Palmer can feel it in his bones.
Everything else kind of went to the back burner. Really, my focus began strictly on Candy Zito.
Who is this woman?
So Candy is a young white female. Her parents live in the Chelsea, Alabama area.
Candy grew up in a very wealthy family. She didn't want for anything. She had been married previously, and she had a daughter, and at the time that we were friends, she was a good mom. But we went separate ways. Candy was doing drugs, doing whatever she wanted.
She's 31 years old and has a daughter that was taken away from her because of her behavior.
We're looking at Facebook posts. Pretty much what we were gathering is that Candy was flamboyant. She was kind of this larger-than-life kind of personality. So I decided to actually go to her house in Chelsea, hoping that she might be there. So we pull up to the house, and we're met with Candy's brother pressure washing the driveway area.
Detective Palmer, Leeds PD. Are your parents home?
No.
It turns out that Dad is a government contractor, and he's living in the Middle East with his wife.
Candy's brother was just there to touch up the house for the family.
What about your sister, Candy?
He hasn't seen her in quite some time, and he kind of gives me the backstory that Candy's not allowed inside the house because Candy's had issues with mom and dad.
Candy's family had pretty much washed their hands clean of Candy.
As I'm walking around the property, I'm just taking pictures of the house. Then one of the things I noticed, there's a tent set up in the backyard, and what we're believing at this point is that Candy might have been staying in this tent.
She's 31 years old, and she's living in a tent in the backyard of her parents' home. Excuse me?
He was going to tell his sister, hey, the detectives came by here, they want to talk to you.
So Candy's whereabouts are currently unknown. When Palmer returns to the office, he finally receives the detailed records of Anthony Gibson's cell phone to include text messages.
What we discover is there was a communication between Anthony and Candy through text message. Candy's telling Anthony that she doesn't have money, she's broke, starving, she hasn't eaten in days, and so she's really putting a guilt trip on Anthony at this point.
But that's not all. Palmer also finds pictures of Candy in various stages of undress and promises of sexual activity with Anthony.
The text messages revealed that Candy was a very manipulative person.
So he agrees to bring her food to her tent in the backyard.
So now we know, based on the text conversation, that she was in communication with Anthony on the night of his disappearance.
Candy is sweet, but not this one. This Candy is contact poison. So Anthony Gibson is murdered after Candy Zito asked him to bring her food, which he agrees to do. Most likely, that was Anthony's last act of kindness on this earth.
What stood up to me about Candy was the fact that she lied to us during the investigation initially.
Candy told Palmer she hadn't talked to Anthony Gibson in years. But in reality, she contacted him and sent naked pictures of herself to him on July 2nd. A matter of days, not years. Days. The issue is we need to find Candy Zito. And since this girl doesn't have anything, including a cell phone, she's probably in Anthony Gibson's car.
When I was speaking to Anthony's grandmother, Kathy, she was able to tell me that on the back of the car was a bumper sticker
My child shines at Oliver Elementary. So Palmer, in his instincts, notes the bumper sticker.
And we put a be on the lookout, a bolo for that vehicle. Put it out in the media. I want the news to broadcast it. What the tag number is, what the description of the vehicle is. I'm looking to get as much attention to Candy as I can.
Candy was all over every news outlet.
When they put the picture out as the person of interest, I think people were like, well, who's this lady?
Palmer then gets a phone call.
No kidding.
A taxpayer says, hey, I was at a 4th of July party, and Candy Zito was there driving this little white car. Really? The person says, the thing I thought that was odd about it is it didn't have a license plate on it. She's removed the plate so it doesn't hit as a stolen car. She is now panicked, and she's on the run. But even when it seems like there's nowhere to go, Palmer is a quintessential detective. He pushes when there's nowhere to push. He looks where there's nothing to see.
At some point, I'm reviewing my photographs that I took at Candy Zito's parents' house. And when I'm reviewing it, I see what appears to be coagulated blood where the grass and the concrete meet from the driveway.
Palmer thinks back to the moment when they went to the house to find her. What's her brother doing? He's power washing the driveway. Why are you doing that? So he sends a crime lab and says, see if you can find traces of human blood on the driveway. You can power wash blood all you want, but blood is like water. It seeks the line of least resistance. There are cracks in the asphalt, seams in the cement, all kinds of places where blood will collect. They discover evidence of human blood. Not dog blood, not deer blood, human blood. Well, my.
I'm thinking we probably know where the murder started. So the next day, we get a tip from Davies County, Indiana, that Candy may be in the area. What we discover is that she actually has a grandmother that lives in Indiana.
The grandmother called and said, my granddaughter tried to come here. There was a guy with her, and she wouldn't let them in.
And so my ask of them was, hey, if you guys spot them, please give me a call as soon as possible.
So they put the word out to the troops. It doesn't take long, and one of the patrol deputies sees the car.
Contact with the alarm company.
Recognizes the bumper sticker. He turns on his overhead lights, and the moment he turns those lights on, now we have a pursuit. You wonder what's going through someone's mind when they run. Because what do they think? Are they gonna get away? Come on. Tires overheat at high speed, particularly in a small car. And when a tire fails at 100 miles an hour, you're not going to control it unless you're a NASCAR driver. If you think this is going to end well, you're sorely mistaken, my dear. Candy Zito has been spotted in Indiana. There is no escape. The Indiana deputy pursues the car. Until the driver loses control and impacts an oak tree, completely crushing the car. The passenger is Candy Zito, grievously injured. The driver is near death.
They were both transported to the hospital.
Candy Zito suffered a fractured jaw in multiple places, while the male is in a coma listed in critical condition. But who is he? They discover the driver is Corey Zito. He is a cousin to Candy Zito. He's 26 years old from Louisiana. He has an extensive criminal history to include drug abuse. He's as charming as his cousin. The family that commits crime together stays together.
I know in my heart that Candy Zito was involved. The question was, who is Corey and how is he involved? So we sent a tow truck all the way to Indiana to pick up the car, and what we discovered is there's actually what appears to be a bullet hole in the driver's side door.
They also discover blood in the trunk, which they believe belongs to the victim, Anthony Gibson.
Finding the blood makes one believe that he probably bled to death in the trunk of his own car. So we get a search warrant for Candy's phone, and we discover a lot of photographs of her and her cousin Corey holding what appears to be an AK-47 style rifle.
High velocity, perfectly capable of going through a femur. But the gun is not in the car. They most likely disposed of it somewhere between Alabama and Indiana. Further, there is a picture of Corey and Candy Zito, cousins, in a loving embrace.
There was some kissing involved. It would appear that Candy and Corey were having a romantic relationship outside of being cousins. Pretty weird.
You don't see that. And I lived in West Virginia.
Their family tree probably looks more like a family circle, you know what I mean?
So I immediately started my drive to Indiana to interview Candy. I have to read you your rights if you want to talk.
I don't know what there is to talk about. I was just a passenger in a car.
She's as innocent as the driven snow, and how dare you suggest otherwise?
She's probably used to getting her way, and I could tell in my interview with her that she was trying to manipulate me. Stop playing games with me, all right? Because I know you're lying to me, okay? I've got the upper hand on you, and I'm gonna stick it to you if you don't tell me what happened. What she probably didn't realize is I was also manipulating her.
Okay, on July 2nd, I was at my parents' house setting up the tent. I had no vehicle, so I called my homeboy Anthony to come and bring me food. What's up? Haven't seen you in forever. Gonna kick it. Like homeboys, like friends. And I'm eating, and he's doing dope. And then that happened.
What happened?
When he was trying to be aggressive towards me, sexually, ripped my pants.
She's really implying that there may have been a rape situation that occurred at her house.
And so I start screaming, and my cousin comes out. Says, what the hell are you doing? And he did like a warning shot, I guess. And it hit the car. And then the next one hit the boy in the leg. And then I ran.
She says she sees Anthony go to the ground, and she ran to the backyard and got in the tent, and that's where she stayed.
My cousin saved my life.
Candy is minimizing her own involvement. I didn't do anything. I'm a victim. Anthony is a criminal. Corey is a hero.
Nobody's gonna mess with Bonnie without Clyde coming and handle it. And that's just how it is.
And I'm thinking, Bonnie and Clyde, but I know that they were romantically involved, they were criminals. I don't know if they were cousins or not. By putting the pieces together, there was really no reason for us to believe that Anthony was the aggressor in this scenario.
There are kernels of truth in Candy's statement, but her version of events doesn't exactly add up.
At this point in the investigation, we did not have enough to file a murder charge.
For now, Palmer can hold Candy for stealing Anthony's grandmother's car. But if he doesn't get something more concrete, Candy Zito could walk free.
There's still a lot of loopholes that need to be tidied up. Anthony was at her house. Now the question really remains is just what happened once he got there. Sometime later, they let me know that Corey has now come out of his coma and he is fully awake.
He's still kicking. Not too high, but he's still kicking.
He looks depleted. kind of stares off into space.
Where were you at July? I have no idea. Were you in Alabama? I don't even know when this happened, when it took place.
Ultimately, he doesn't remember any of the details.
It's all new to me.
So he is useless as a potential witness.
We were kind of feeling that maybe we were hitting a dead end.
A few weeks later, a moment of magic happens. Palmer gets a phone call. An inmate in the jail would like to speak to him regarding her cellmate, Candy Zito.
She always came into my room and talked to me about what happened in her case.
She say something maybe about the victim, the guy that was killed.
What I get from it is they brought the guy out there because they knew he had meth.
The true sociopathic reptile rises to the surface. She doesn't want food. She wants drugs.
She said her cousin was there hiding, waiting for the guy to get there so they could rob him.
So she said they were going to rob him for
the drugs that he had.
So based on the informant's testimony, we might be able to gain some clarity on what happened on that fatal night.
Hey.
Candy convinces Anthony Gibson to bring her something to eat.
Thank you. You're the best.
She says Curry emerges from his hiding place, and the robbery goes south rather quickly. Did Anthony fight back? Was Corey scared? Who knows? Either way, a shot is fired.
Ultimately, we don't know who fired the shot.
And a second shot goes through Anthony's leg. She says they threw him in the trunk of his car.
And Anthony is beating frantically to get someone's attention.
Candy told the informant as they drove around, the beating on the trunk lid began to slow down. They take him to the playground. They investigate. Anthony is dead. They soak him in gasoline. They pile a bunch of stuff on him. And they light him up.
She doesn't have any remorse whatsoever. It doesn't even faze her. Like she doesn't feel bad at all.
Anthony Gibson responded to a plea for help, and it got him killed because of who was pleading. A viper, not a human.
At that point, I was able to get the warrant signed for Candy and Corey's charges.
So instead of going to trial, the state reaches plea agreements with Candy and Corey. They both plead guilty to murder and receive 20 years in prison.
20 years, that's what they get. That's crazy. I really just wish they would drop dead.
They're gonna get out. And they're gonna be right back out on the streets to cause another family more grief. Because these are monsters.
I'll think about what was he thinking about when he was in the trunk. What was he thinking about me?
The autumn chill of late October in Ottawa does not just settle on the skin, it sinks deep into the bone, carrying with it the heavy, damp scent of decaying leaves and the unspoken dread of long, dark nights. On the evening of October 25, 1995, the Canadian capital was wrapping itself in a dense, suffocating fog, the kind that blurs the sharp edges of street lamps and turns ordinary suburban neighborhoods into labyrinthine shadows. Inside a modest, warmly lit home, 17-year-old Alain Sylvain Leduc was doing what any responsible, soft-spoken teenager would do on a quiet weeknight. He was watching over his family, stepping into the protective shoes of an older brother while his parents were away. The television hummed a low, comforting melody in the background, a stark contrast to the absolute, predatory silence brewing just beyond the front porch. The door, left unlocked in a neighborhood where people still believed a deadbolt was an unnecessary suspicion, stood as the fragile barrier between a normal adolescence and an unspeakable descent into hell. Sylvain had no connection to the underworld, no debts to settle, and no understanding of the vicious street politics that were currently racing toward his doorstep in a rusted, unmarked cargo van. He was simply a boy who loved his family, a gentle soul caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, trapped in the crosshairs of a monstrous entity known to the local authorities as the Ace Crew. Outside, the darkness was absolute, swallowed by the creeping Ottawa mist that masked the approach of three figures moving with the cold, practiced precision of wolves. They did not knock, they did not announce their presence with a violent crash that would alert the neighbors. Instead, the doorknob turned with a sickeningly smooth click, and the heavy wooden door swung open, letting in a gust of freezing night air and an overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated terror. Before Sylvain could even stand from the couch, before his brain could process the sudden intrusion, the living room was flooded with the stench of cheap liquor, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of firearms. Three young men, their eyes hollow and devoid of any human empathy, stepped into the light. Their faces were hardened by years of street violence, their expressions fixed in a grim, unchanging mask of hostility. They were not looking for wealth, electronics, or money, they were looking for blood, sent on a mission of absolute retaliation by a gang that viewed desertion as a sin punishable by death. In that split second, the comfortable sanctuary of the Leduc home vanished, replaced by an atmosphere so thick with fear that the air itself felt heavy to breathe. The intruders moved like a well-oiled machine of intimidation, their heavy boots thudding against the carpeted floor as they immediately fanned out to cut off any potential exit. One of them, a towering figure with a jagged scar running along his jawline, raised a heavy-barreled handgun, its dark metal catching the soft glow of the living room lamp. He didn't speak a word initially, he merely locked his eyes onto Sylvain, the coldness in his stare carrying a weight heavier than any spoken threat. Sylvain's younger cousin, a terrified young girl who had sought refuge in this house to escape the very monsters now standing before her, shrank into the corner of the room, her breath catching in her throat as her worst nightmare materialized in the flesh. She had tried to flee the suffocating grip of the Ace Crew, a gang that treated its members as property, but the gang's reach was long, and their patience was non-existent. Alongside her were another young niece and a teenage friend of Sylvain, all of them suddenly frozen in place, their bodies rigid, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. The silence was shattered not by a scream, but by the sharp, metallic click of a firearm being cocked, a sound that resonated through the small house with a terrifying finality. The leader of the trio stepped forward, his voice a low, raspy growl that demanded immediate, unquestioning obedience. He barked orders with an authority born of absolute ruthlessness, making it clear that any resistance would result in immediate bloodshed right there on the living room rug. Sylvain, driven by a desperate, instinctual desire to protect the vulnerable girls behind him, took a half-step forward, his hands raised in a universal gesture of peace, his voice trembling but earnest as he tried to defuse the situation. But the Ace Crew did not come to negotiate. The response to Sylvain's plea was a swift, brutal backhand from the heavy pistol, the metal cracking against his cheekbone with a sickening thud that sent him stumbling backward, blood instantly welling from a jagged tear in his skin. The message was unmistakable: survival depended on total submission. With brutal efficiency, the three gang members corralled the four terrified teenagers toward the front door, shoving them out into the freezing Ottawa night. The mist swallowed them instantly, hiding the grim procession from the rest of the sleeping neighborhood. Parked at the curb, its engine idling with a low, menacing rumble, was a white cargo van. It was a vehicle designed for utility, but on this night, it served as a mobile dungeon. The rear doors were flung open, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black interior completely devoid of windows, handles, or any means of escape from the inside. One by one, the teenagers were brutally forced into the cold metal belly of the van. Sylvain went last, his body aching from the initial blow, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend how a quiet Wednesday evening had mutated into a hostage situation. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening, metallic boom, throwing the victims into absolute, suffocating darkness, followed by the heavy clack of an exterior padlock sealing their fate. Inside the moving tomb, the psychological torture began almost immediately. The van lurched forward, its tires screeching against the damp asphalt as it sped away from the safety of the suburban neighborhood and plunged into the underbelly of the city. The teenagers were tossed around the empty metal cargo bay as the vehicle took sharp, aggressive turns. Every bump in the road reverberated through the steel floor, sending vibrations through their trembling bodies. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the terror inflicted by their captors who sat in the front cabin, separated only by a thin partition. Through the darkness, the victims could hear the distinctive, terrifying sounds of the gang members playing with their weapons. The rhythmic click-clack of ammunition being chambered and ejected, over and over again, echoed through the confined space like a countdown clock. It was a calculated tactic designed to break their spirits, to ensure that fear kept them silent and paralyzed. Sylvain, despite the overwhelming darkness and the throbbing pain in his face, tried to whisper words of comfort to the crying girls huddled against the far wall of the van. He reached out in the blind dark, his fingers finding his cousin's trembling hand, offering a squeeze of reassurance he did not truly feel. He was only 17, an age where life should consist of high school sports, future dreams, and innocent anxieties, yet he was suddenly forced to carry the weight of 3 other lives on his shoulders. Every time Sylvain tried to raise his voice above a whisper to ask where they were being taken or what the men wanted, the response from the front seat was immediate and violent. The partition would slide open, or a heavy boot would kick against the metal barrier, followed by a barrage of profanities and promises of death if they didn't shut up. The sheer unpredictability of their captors turned every second into an agonizing eternity, where the simple act of breathing felt like a gamble against a bullet. The journey seemed to last for hours, though in reality, it was a rapid, direct route to a pre-selected slaughterhouse. The van finally slowed down, its brakes groaning as it navigated the tight turns of an unfamiliar apartment complex situated on the bleak outskirts of Ottawa. When the vehicle came to a final, abrupt halt, the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the roar of the engine. The exterior padlock rattled, the heavy doors swung open, and the harsh, artificial glare of the parking lot lights blinded the teenagers' adjusted eyes. They were dragged out of the van like cattle, the freezing wind biting through their clothes as they were marched toward the rear entrance of a drab, unassuming 3-story apartment building. The neighborhood was quiet, the residents behind closed doors completely unaware that a convoy of death was passing through their hallways. As they were forced up the concrete stairwell to the 3rd floor, Sylvain's eyes darted around, desperately searching for a security camera, an open door, or any sign of life that could offer a shred of hope. But the hallways were barren, smelling of old cooking grease and industrial cleaner. The captors pushed them toward the door at the very end of the hall, which opened before they could even knock. Inside, the true scale of the trap became horrifyingly clear. This was not a hideout for 3 desperate men, it was a stronghold. The small, dimly lit apartment was crowded with approximately 11 members and associates of the ACE crew, a gathering of hardened individuals whose faces bore the unmistakable signs of a life defined by criminality and violence. The air in the room was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy, intoxicating scent of cheap beer, but beneath it all lay an atmosphere of calculated, meticulous preparation. The teenagers were instantly separated, stripped of any remaining sense of security as they were pushed into the center of the living room. The gang members moved around them with a chilling calmness, showing no hesitation or remorse for the fact that they were terrorizing children. With methodical cruelty, they produced thick ropes, heavy strips of cloth, and rolls of industrial wire. One by one, the victims were forced onto the floor. Their wrists were bound tightly behind their backs, the coarse rope biting into their skin until their hands turned a ghostly, circulation-deprived white. Thick fabric was tied securely over their eyes, plunging them back into a terrifying darkness where they could only rely on their senses of hearing and touch to understand the horror unfolding around them. The final, most sadistic touch was the arrival of thin, sharp wire, which was looped tightly around their necks, a constant, lethal reminder that any sudden movement or attempt to scream would result in self-strangulation. Sylvain lay on the cold floor, his heart hammering against the linoleum, listening to the muffled sobs of the girls beside him. He could hear the heavy footsteps of the gang members pacing the room, the clinking of glass bottles, and the low, muttered conversations that carried an ominous tone of finality. It was during these agonizing moments of sensory deprivation that the true horror of their situation began to reveal itself through small, audio clues. Sylvain heard the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy fabric being dragged across the floor, followed by the sharp, tearing noise of adhesive tape. The Ace crew was not just holding them hostage, they were preparing a crime scene. They were hanging thick, heavy blankets and dark curtains over every window to ensure that no desperate cries for help or flashes of violence could pierce the night and alert the outside world. Even more chilling was the rustling sound of large, black industrial garbage bags being unrolled and taped meticulously along the walls and across the floor of a nearby storage closet. It was the sound of an execution chamber being waterproofed, a calculated effort to contain the imminent flow of blood and facilitate the quick, unhindered disposal of bodies. The sheer lack of emotion with which these preparations were carried out indicated a group that had long since abandoned their humanity. They were treating human lives as a logistical problem to be solved, a mess to be cleared away before the sun rose. Sylvain, paralyzed by the wires around his neck and the blindfold cutting off his vision, could only listen in absolute horror as the realization dawned on him that they were never meant to leave this apartment alive. Suddenly, the heavy grip of multiple hands tore Sylvain away from the floor, lifting his bound body with effortless, brutal force. He tried to plant his feet, to find some leverage, but he was completely overpowered, dragged away from the living room and the muffled cries of his family. The sound of a door creaking open signaled his arrival into the master bedroom, a space that had been transformed into a private arena of torment. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the last faint sounds of the outside world, leaving him alone in the dark with a wolf pack that had spent the entire night whipped into a frenzy of tribal anger and bloodlust. They did not ask him questions, they did not seek information that he didn't possess. His mere presence as a protective figure, a male relative who dared to stand between them and their target, made him the ultimate lightning rod for their collective malice. The assault began without warning, a sudden, explosive burst of violence that shattered the silence of the room. A heavy blow struck the back of Sylvain's head, sending a white-hot flash of pain through his skull and forcing him to his knees. Before he could even gasp for air, another strike landed against his ribs, followed by a relentless, coordinated barrage of kicks and punches from every angle. The members of the Ace crew took turns, moving in and out of the shadows to inflict maximum suffering, treating the 17-year-old's body as a canvas for their depravity. They used their heavy, steel-toed boots, the blunt ends of their weapons, and any objects within reach to systematically break his spirit and his body. Sylvain's muffled groans were swallowed by the thick walls of the apartment, his desperate attempts to protect his vital organs thwarted by the ropes binding his arms behind his back. Through the fog of escalating pain and fading consciousness, Sylvain could hear the heavy breathing of his attackers, their low, twisted laughter echoing in the small room as they congratulated each other on the force of their blows. There was no passion in their violence, no sudden burst of uncontrollable rage. It was a cold, systematic execution carried out by a group of individuals who felt entirely untouchable, insulated by the darkness of the night and the terrifying reputation of their badge. For what felt like hours, the young man endured a level of brutality that defied comprehension, his body slowly succumbing to the overwhelming trauma, his thoughts drifting away from the horrific reality of the apartment and toward the peaceful, fog-covered home he had been torn from just hours prior. As his strength finally began to wane, the sounds of his tormentors grew distant, replaced by a heavy, enveloping silence that signaled the approaching end of a nightmare that should never have begun. To fully comprehend the depth of the tragedy that swallowed Alain Sylvain Leduc on that bleak October night, one must journey backward into the fractured social landscape of Ottawa in the mid-1990s, a city caught in a quiet but violent transition. To the outside world, Canada's capital was a picturesque postcard of Gothic Parliament buildings, serene waterways, and manicured suburban lawns where safety was taken for granted and the harsh realities of urban decay seemed like a distant foreign concept. But beneath this sterile, bureaucratic facade lay a subterranean world that the tourism brochures deliberately ignored, a world where systemic neglect, poverty, and a lack of opportunities had allowed a bitter subculture to take root in the shadows of the government towers. In neighborhoods like Vonia and certain neglected pockets of the city's West End, the pristine image of Ottawa dissolved into a landscape of drab, concrete apartment complexes, dimly lit alleyways, and convenience store parking lots where disillusioned youths gathered out of a desperate desire for belonging. It was within these forgotten urban fractures that the Ace Crew flourished, a predatory gang that filled the void left by broken homes and an indifferent social system, offering a twisted version of brotherhood that was wrapped in absolute criminality and enforced through unmitigated terror. The Ace Crew was not merely a disorganized street gang or a loose collection of rebellious teenagers looking for trouble. They were a highly structured, fiercely tribal criminal enterprise that operated with a chilling corporate efficiency. They controlled the local trade in illicit substances, ran sophisticated extortion rackets that targeted vulnerable businesses, and used an intricate network of intimidation to silence anyone who dared to cross their path. For the young men and women who fell into their orbit, the gang offered an intoxicating mix of fast money, artificial respect, and a protective shield against a world that had marginalized them, but this shield came at a catastrophic price. The leadership of the Ace Crew demanded a level of blind, fanatical loyalty that bordered on cultish devotion, viewing its members not as human beings but as disposable assets and personal property. Once a person crossed the threshold into their inner circle, the exit doors were permanently welded shut, and any attempt to distance oneself from the group's illegal activities was viewed as an act of treason that could only be cleansed through extreme physical retribution. The gang's reputation for savagery was their most potent currency, and they guarded it fiercely, knowing that a single perception of weakness would shatter their control over the city's lucrative underbelly. It was into this volatile, predatory environment that Sylvain Leduc's teenage cousin was tragically drawn, an innocent mistake born of youth, vulnerability, and the deceptive allure of the street life. Like many young people who found themselves ensnared by the Ace Crew, she had initially seen only the flashy exterior, the promise of protection, and a sense of family that she desperately craved in her own life. However, the illusion was shattered almost immediately as she was forced to witness the group's true nature, an endless cycle of brutal initiations, systematic exploitation, and a casual willingness to use extreme violence to settle the petty disputes of their leaders. She quickly realized that she was not a member of a brotherhood, but a captive in a predatory syndicate that viewed her youth and vulnerability as resources to be exploited. The psychological toll of living under the constant, suffocating surveillance of the gang became unbearable, as she watched friends beaten for minor infractions and realized that her own humanity was being systematically stripped away by a leadership that thrived on the degradation of others. Driven by a desperate, survivalist instinct to reclaim her life and escape a trajectory that would inevitably lead to prison or a premature grave, the young girl made the courageous but incredibly perilous decision to break her ties with the Ace Crew. She waited for a moment when the gang's vigilance wavered, slipped away into the anonymity of the Ottawa transit system, and fled across the city, leaving behind every possession and connection she had ever known. But running from an organization like the Ace Crew was an illusion, as their network of informants, lookouts, and low-level associates stretched into almost every neighborhood, creating a web of eyes and ears that made true escape nearly impossible. The gang leadership did not view her departure simply as a loss of a follower. They saw it as a direct, public challenge to their authority and a dangerous precedent that could encourage others to mutiny. To maintain their iron grip over their ranks, they needed to make an example of her, to hunt her down and inflict a punishment so severe that no one else would ever dare to dream of walking away. Seeking sanctuary from the wolves that she knew would soon be on her trail, the terrified girl turned to the only place she believed the gang's shadow could not reach, the warm, stable home of her aunt and uncle, the Leduc family. The Leduc household was the absolute antithesis of the chaotic, violent world she was trying to leave behind, a place where life revolved around the simple, wholesome rhythms of working-class Canadian life. It was a home filled with the sounds of laughter, shared meals, and the quiet comfort of a family that genuinely cared for one another, anchored by parents who worked hard to provide a safe, nurturing environment for their children. To the cousin, this modest suburban house felt like a fortress against the darkness, a sanctuary where she could finally breathe without looking over her shoulder, believing that the gang would never bother to look for her in a neighborhood so far removed from their usual urban hunting grounds. She kept the full extent of her terror hidden from her relatives, out of a mix of deep shame for her past associations and a desperate desire to protect them from the toxic world she had accidentally brought to their doorstep. In the center of this protective family dynamic was 17-year-old Alain Sylvain Leduc, a young man who represented everything good, promising, and innocent about his generation. Sylvain was not a creature of the streets. He had never coveted the cheap status symbols of gang life, nor had he ever crossed paths with the law. He was a gentle giant, known among his peers and teachers for his quiet demeanor, his quick, unassuming smile, and an innate sense of responsibility that made him seem mature beyond his 17 years. He spent his days focusing on his high school studies, helping his parents with household chores without complaint, and looking out for his younger siblings with a protective tenderness that defined his character. Sylvain's world was one of simple pleasures, sports, music, and hanging out with a close-knit circle of friends who valued him for his loyalty and his steady, dependable presence. He had a bright future ahead of him, a blank canvas of possibilities that he was preparing to paint with hard work and honesty, completely unaware that his life was being steered toward a horrific collision course with a monstrous force he didn't even know existed. As the leaves turned from vibrant gold to a dull, skeletal brown and the Ottawa autumn grew progressively colder, the ACE crew launched a relentless, systematic manhunt across the city to locate their missing property. They turned the streets upside down, putting immense pressure on their low-level drug runners, threatening acquaintances, and monitoring the locations of anyone who had ever spoken to the girl. The leaders of the gang were furious that a teenager had successfully evaded their grasp for so long, and their obsession with finding her grew with each passing day, mutating into a matter of pride for a group that considered themselves the undisputed kings of the city's criminal underworld. They worked through a process of elimination, mapping out her extended family connections, tracing her movements through whispered rumors, and slowly narrowing the circle until their focus inevitably landed on the quiet, unsuspecting suburban street where Sylvain lived. They didn't care about the innocence of the people housing her, nor did they possess the moral capacity to hesitate before bringing their brand of urban warfare into a peaceful neighborhood. By the time the fateful afternoon of October 25 arrived, the trap had been set, though the Leduc family remained completely oblivious to the gathering storm clouds outside their windows. The weather that day seemed to mirror the unfolding tragedy, as a dense, freezing fog rolled in from the Ottawa River, blanketing the city in a gray, oppressive mist that muffled sounds and reduced visibility to just a few feet. It was a day that compelled people to stay indoors, to seek the warmth of their hearths and shut out the hostile elements. When Sylvain's parents announced that they had to leave the house for the evening to attend to personal matters, Sylvain accepted the responsibility of watching over the home and his cousins with his characteristic willingness. He reassured his mother with a warm hug, telling her not to worry and that he would keep the doors locked and the kids safe until they returned. It was an ordinary exchange, a routine moment of family life that would later haunt the survivors as the last time they would ever see the gentle teenager whole, unbroken, and smiling. As darkness fell and the fog thickened into an impenetrable white wall, the Leduc living room became a cozy oasis against the freezing night, with the television providing a gentle, flickering light and a low hum of entertainment. Sylvain, his cousin, another young niece, and a neighborhood friend who had dropped by to hang out were all gathered together, sharing snacks and talking about the mundane worries of high school life. For a few hours, the cousin felt a rare sense of peace, believing that she had finally found a safe haven where the nightmares of her past could no longer touch her. She watched Sylvain interact with the younger kids, his calm, authoritative yet gentle presence anchoring the room, giving everyone a profound sense of security. But outside, navigating through the blinding fog with their headlights turned low, the vanguard of the ACE crew was turning onto their street, their rusted cargo van moving like a ghost ship through the mist. Carrying within it a trio of remorseless killers who were ready to tear this peaceful sanctuary to shreds. To truly feel the weight of what was stolen from the world on that foggy October night, one must pause and look deeply into the quiet, unassuming life of Alain Sylvain Leduc, a 17-year-old boy whose existence was defined not by grand ambitions or chaotic drama, but by a profound, everyday goodness. Sylvain was the kind of son every parent secretly prayed for, a gentle young man who possessed a rare combination of physical strength and emotional tenderness. Standing tall with the broad shoulders of a youth transitioning into manhood, he carried himself with a natural modesty, never using his size to intimidate, but rather to shield those around him who were smaller or more vulnerable. His face was a mirror of his internal innocence, marked by bright, clear eyes that looked at the world without malice and an easy, frequent smile that could instantly disarm the tension in any room. In a world that often celebrated cynicism and aggression, Sylvain remained stubbornly, beautifully kind, a reflection of the hard-working, loving family that had raised him in the quiet suburbs of Ottawa. He loved his parents with a fierce, unspoken devotion, recognizing the sacrifices they made every day to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table, and he took it upon himself to repay that love by being a pillar of support within the household. His days were filled with the predictable, comforting rhythms of a typical Canadian teenager, structured around his high school classes, his favorite sports, and the tight-knit circle of friends who viewed him as their emotional anchor. Teachers remembered Sylvain as a diligent, quiet student who sat near the back of the classroom, never causing trouble, always turning in his assignments on time, and showing a polite respect to everyone he encountered. He wasn't driven by a desire for fame or the superficial status symbols that captivated so many of his peers. His aspirations were modest, grounded, and intensely practical, focused on graduating high school, finding a steady job, and eventually building a life of his own based on the same honest principles his parents lived by. On the weekends, he could often be found playing pickup hockey on the local rinks, his laughter echoing across the ice as he glided through the freezing winter air, or hanging out in his backyard, tinkering with old bicycles and listening to the rock music that defined his generation. There was a beautiful, unblemished simplicity to his life, an absence of greed or darkness that made his ultimate fate not just a tragedy, but a profound violation of the natural order of things. But where Sylvain truly shone, where his character was most beautifully on display, was in his role as a protector and a brother within the extended Leduc family. He possessed an innate, almost paternal sense of responsibility that extended to anyone who was hurting or in need of shelter, a quality that made him the natural choice to look after the younger children whenever the adults had to step away. He didn't view babysitting his younger siblings or cousins as a chore or an annoyance. He approached it with a genuine, patient enthusiasm, creating games to keep them entertained, helping them with their homework, and making sure they felt completely safe and loved. The younger kids looked up to him as a real-life superhero, a giant, gentle force who was always ready with a comforting word, a warm hug, or a silly joke to chase away their fears. It was this exact, unyielding protective instinct that would ultimately define his actions on the night the monsters came to his door, an instinct that prevented him from running or hiding, choosing instead to stand firmly between the wolves and the innocent children he had promised to protect. The tragedy of Sylvain Leduc is magnified exponentially by his complete, absolute detachment from the criminal underworld that took his life. He did not know the names of the men who broke into his home, he had never stepped foot in the gritty neighborhoods where they operated, and he had no understanding of the toxic, fragile egos that governed the hierarchy of the ace crew. He was a complete bystander, a casualty of a war he wasn't fighting, drawn into a vortex of unimaginable violence simply because his heart was large enough to offer shelter to a cousin who was running for her life. When his cousin arrived at the Leduc home, terrified and exhausted, Sylvain didn't demand explanations or judge her for the choices she had made. He simply opened the door, offered her a seat on the couch, and treated her with the same unconditional kindness he showed to everyone else. He believed, with the naive innocence of a boy who had never known true evil, that the walls of his family home were impenetrable, that the love and security they shared could keep the darkness of the city at bay. As the afternoon of October 25 transitioned into a cold, suffocating twilight, Sylvain went about his evening routine with an air of calm efficiency, unaware that the sands of his life were rapidly running out. He helped his mother prepare a simple dinner, the kitchen filling with the warm, savory aromas of home-cooked food, a sensory memory that would later haunt the survivors as the last scent of safety they would ever know. When his parents left the house, Sylvain took his position in the living room, ensuring the younger kids were settled and comfortable, his presence alone creating an atmosphere of total peace against the freezing fog that was pressing against the window panes. He was just a boy, 17 years old, standing on the threshold of a long and beautiful life, filled with unspoken dreams and infinite potential, completely unaware that in just a few short hours, his innocence would be met with an explosion of absolute, unmitigated savagery that would leave his family permanently broken and his city forever changed. The ticking of the living room clock grew heavier as the night deepened, its rhythmic pulse the only sound competing with the low hum of the television screen. Inside the warmth of the Leduc home, the atmosphere was one of quiet, domestic peace, a stark contrast to the predatory stillness that had settled over the fog-drenched street outside. Alain Sylvain Leduc sat relaxed on the sofa, his long legs stretched out, an embodiment of teenage calm that anchored the room. His cousin, the young girl who had spent weeks looking over her shoulder, had finally allowed her shoulders to drop, comforted by the steady, unbothered presence of her 17-year-old protector. They were talking about nothing in particular, just the mundane gossip of high school and plans for the upcoming weekend, their voices floating through the cozy air of a home that had known only safety. Then, with an abruptness that made everyone's heart stop, the handle of the front door turned. There was no warning knock, no hurried footsteps on the porch, just the sharp, mechanical click of a latch slipping out of its strike plate. The heavy wooden door swung inward, and a gust of freezing, mist-laden air rushed into the room, bringing with it three figures wrapped in oversized dark jackets, their eyes burning with a cold, frantic energy that immediately sucked the oxygen out of the space. Before Sylvain could fully push himself up from the cushions, the sanctuary was violated. The lead intruder, a man whose hardened features spoke of a lifetime spent in the brutal hierarchies of the ace crew, crossed the threshold with a heavy, deliberate step, his hand already emerging from his deep pocket clutching the matte black frame of a heavy handgun. The metal caught the soft light of the living room lamp, reflecting a dull, lethal glint that froze the teenagers in their tracks. The young cousin let out a sharp, choked gasp, her body instantly recognizing the faces of the monsters she had tried so desperately to leave behind. The two other gang members fanned out with practiced efficiency, their heavy boots thudding against the carpeted floor as they moved to block the hallway and the kitchen exit, effectively sealing the room. Sylvain, his protective instincts overriding the sudden surge of adrenaline-fueled panic, stepped forward to position his large frame between the armed men and the terrified girls huddled behind him. He raised his open hands in a universal plea for calm, his voice steady but laced with a desperate urgency as he asked them what they wanted, making it clear that there were only children in the house. The answer he received was not one of words, but of immediate, unyielding brutality. The leader lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron barrel of the pistol in a vicious arc that connected squarely with Sylvain's cheekbone, the impact making a sickening, hollow sound that echoed through the small house and sent the teenager crashing hard onto the linoleum floor. Blood instantly began to pool from the jagged tear on Sylvain's face, but before he could even process the blinding flash of pain, he was violently yanked upward by his collar, his shirt tearing under the strain as the men forced him and the three other terrified youth out into the freezing night. The Ottawa fog swallowed their frantic breaths, hiding the grim procession from the dark, sleeping windows of the neighborhood as they were shoved toward the curb where a white, unmarked cargo van sat idling, its exhaust pipe spewing thick plumes of gray smoke into the winter air. The heavy rear doors were flung open, revealing an empty, pitch-black metal cavern that smelled of rust and cold machinery. One by one, the teenagers were brutally hoisted into the belly of the vehicle, Sylvain going last, his body aching from the initial strike, his mind racing to find a logical explanation for a nightmare that defies all reason. The massive steel doors slammed shut with a deafening, metallic boom that reverberated through their bones, followed immediately by the heavy, definitive clack of an exterior padlock being snapped into place, throwing them into an absolute, suffocating darkness where they could no longer tell where the walls ended and the terror began. The journey through the labyrinthine streets of Ottawa was an exercise in psychological torment, a calculated descent into hell engineered by the three captors sitting behind the thin metal partition in the front cabin. The van lurched forward with a violent screech of its tires, accelerating aggressively through the mist, throwing the bound, unseeing teenagers against the hard ribbing of the steel floor as the driver took sharp, erratic turns designed to disorient them. In the pitch blackness of the cargo hold, the silence was broken by the terrifying, repetitive sounds coming from the front seats, the distinctive, mechanical clatter of handguns being loaded, slides being racked back, and live ammunition being chambered and ejected over and over again echoed through the confined space like a horrific countdown clock. Every time Sylvain tried to raise his voice above a desperate whisper to comfort the weeping girls or to ask where they were being taken, a heavy boot would slam against the partition from the other side, accompanied by a barrage of vile profanities and explicit promises of a bullet to the head if they did not remain completely silent. Sylvain reached out into the blind dark, his trembling fingers finding his cousin's ice-cold hand and squeezing it with a strength he did not feel, refusing to let go even as the vehicle bounced violently over potholed roads. Deeper into the urban fringe where the authority of the law felt miles away. When the van finally groaned to a halt, the sudden absence of the engine's roar was more terrifying than the ride itself, replaced by the heavy footsteps of multiple men approaching the rear of the vehicle. The padlock rattled against the latch, the doors flew open, and the harsh, orange glare of a suburban parking lot light blinded the victims' dilated eyes as they were dragged out by their hair and clothing, the freezing wind biting through their thin shirts. They were marched up a cold, concrete stairwell of a drab, unassuming three-story apartment complex at the edge of town, the hallways smelling of stale grease and industrial cleaner, completely deserted in the dead of night. The captors pushed them toward the door at the very end of the hall, which opened before they could even knock, revealing the true, monstrous scale of the trap they had fallen into. The small, dimly lit apartment was crowded with roughly 11 members and associates of the ACE crew, a gathering of hardened individuals whose faces bore the hollow, remorseless expressions of a life defined by systemic violence. The air thick with the suffocating stench of cheap tobacco and stale beer. The teenagers were instantly forced onto the floor, their remaining dignity stripped away as the gang members moved around them with a chilling, businesslike calmness, showing absolutely no hesitation or moral conflict about the fact that they were terrorizing defenseless children. With methodical cruelty, they produced thick ropes and heavy rolls of industrial wire, pinning the victims down and binding their wrists behind their backs so tightly that the skin split and their hands grew numb and pale. Thick, dark fabric was tied securely over their eyes, plunging them back into a terrifying sensory deprivation where every movement had to be guessed by sound alone. The final, most sadistic touch of their restraint was the arrival of thin, sharp wire, which was looped tightly around each of their necks and anchored to their bindings, creating a lethal mechanism where any sudden movement, attempt to struggle, or desperate scream for help would cause the wire to tighten, resulting in immediate self-strangulation. Sylvain lay on the cold linoleum, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his ears straining to interpret the ominous noises echoing around the room. He heard the distinct, heavy sound of thick blankets and dark curtains being dragged across the floor and nailed frantically over the window frames. A calculated effort by the ACE crew to ensure that no flashes of violence or desperate cries could pierce the night and alert the residents of the building. Even more terrifying was the rhythmic, tearing sound of heavy adhesive tape being unrolled and applied to the walls and floor of a nearby storage closet, followed by the unmistakable rustling of large, black industrial garbage bags being spread out to cover every surface. It was the sound of an execution chamber being prepared with horrific foresight, a deliberate, cold-blooded measure to contain the imminent flow of blood and facilitate the quick, unhindered disposal of bodies. The illusion of an interrogation or a negotiation vanished completely when the heavy grip of multiple hands suddenly tore Sylvain away from the floor, lifting his bound body with effortless, brutal force that left his feet dangling. He tried to plant his boots, to find some semblance of leverage, but he was completely overpowered, dragged away from the living room and the muffled, terrified sobs of his family members. The sound of a door creaking open signaled his arrival into the master bedroom, a space that had been entirely transformed into a private arena of torment where the rule of the street reigned supreme. The door slammed shut behind him, the heavy lock clicking into place and cutting off the last faint sounds of the outside world, leaving the 17-year-old boy alone in the dark with a wolf pack that had spent the entire evening whipping themselves into a collective frenzy of tribal anger and unmitigated bloodlust. The assault began without a single word of explanation, an explosive burst of savage violence that shattered the silence of the bedroom and left no room for mercy. A heavy, unseen blow struck the back of Sylvain's head, sending a white-hot flash of agony through his skull and forcing him heavily onto his knees on the hard floor. Before he could even gasp for air or orient himself in the blindness of his blindfold, another crushing strike landed against his ribs, followed by a relentless, coordinated barrage of kicks, punches, and blows from every conceivable angle. The members of the ACE crew took turns stepping out of the shadows to inflict maximum physical trauma, treating the young man's defenseless body as a canvas for their depravity, using their heavy, steel-toed boots and the blunt ends of their weapons to systematically break his bones and his spirit. Sylvain's muffled groans were swallowed by the thick walls of the apartment, his desperate, instinctual attempts to curl into a protective fetal position completely thwarted by the ropes binding his arms behind his back, forcing him to bear the full, unmitigated weight of their hatred. Through the escalating fog of excruciating pain and fading consciousness, Sylvain could hear the heavy breathing of his attackers, their low, twisted laughter echoing in the small room as they congratulated each other on the force of their blows and encouraged more violence. There was no heat in their cruelty, no sudden burst of uncontrollable passion. It was a cold, systematic execution carried out by a group of individuals who felt entirely untouchable, insulated by the darkness of the night and the terrifying reputation of their gang. For what felt like an eternity, the young man endured a level of brutality that defied human comprehension, his vital organs slowly failing under the overwhelming trauma, his thoughts drifting away from the horrific reality of the apartment and toward the peaceful, fog-covered home he had been torn from just hours prior. As his physical strength finally began to wane and his breathing became shallow and ragged, the sounds of his tormentors grew distant, replaced by a heavy, enveloping silence that signaled the approaching end of a life that had only just begun. The dense, suffocating silence that fell over the master bedroom of the third-floor apartment in the wake of Sylvain Leduc's final, shallow breath was heavier than the freezing fog pressing against the blacked-out windows. Inside that darkened room, the air was thick with the copper stench of fresh blood, the acrid odor of sweat, and the residue of an explosion of violence that had left a 17-year-old boy broken and lifeless on the linoleum floor. The members of the ACE crew stood over the still form of their victim, their heavy breathing slowly returning to a normal rhythm as the initial rush of adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind the cold, transactional reality of what they had done. There was no sudden panic among the killers, no rushed realization of the gravity of their crime. Instead, they moved with a chilling, calculated efficiency that demonstrated just how detached they were from the value of human life. The leader of the group stepped forward, using the toe of his boot to turn Sylvain's face, confirming that the boy's heart had stopped beating under the weight of the trauma. With a low, muttered command, he signaled the rest of the gang to begin the final phase of their operation, turning their attention toward the rolls of heavy black industrial garbage bags and the adhesive tape that had been meticulously prepared along the walls of the storage closet. The primary objective of the group shifted immediately from execution to concealment, a logistical process they approached with the same lack of emotion one might reserve for disposing of ordinary household waste. Two of the younger gang members were ordered to pull Sylvain's body toward the closet, their boots sliding slightly on the slick floor as they dragged the heavy weight across the room, the plastic bags rustling loudly in the quiet apartment. They began wrapping the body tightly, layer after layer, securing the plastic with thick bands of silver duct tape, ensuring that no fluids could escape and no scent could pierce the packaging during the transport they had planned for later that night. In the living room, the three remaining victims lay bound, blindfolded, and paralyzed by the wire loops around their necks, listening to the horrifying sounds of the plastic tearing and the heavy thuds coming from the adjacent room. Knowing with absolute certainty that Sylvain was gone and that they were meant to be next. The leader walked back into the living room, his hands still stained with the dark residue of the assault, and pointed his finger toward Sylvain's teenage friend, gesturing for two other men to grab him and drag him into the bedroom to continue the execution. But human arrogance, no matter how carefully insulated by the reputation of a criminal organization, always leaves behind a fatal flaw, and for the ACE crew, that flaw was the sheer volume of their own cruelty. In an apartment building with thin, aging drywall and shared ventilation shafts, the heavy thuds of the assault, the rhythmic dragging of furniture, and the muffled, desperate groans of Sylvain during his final moments had not gone entirely unnoticed. 2 floors below, an elderly resident who had lived in the complex for decades sat awake in his armchair, his sensitive hearing picking up the unusual, rhythmic vibrations traveling down the plumbing lines and through the concrete ceiling. He had lived through the changing dynamics of the neighborhood, recognizing the difference between a loud party and the distinct, desperate sounds of a struggle, and the persistent, heavy thuds coming from the third floor filled him with an inescapable sense of dread. Trusting his instincts over the comforting urge to ignore the disturbance, the old man reached for his rotary telephone, his trembling fingers dialing the local emergency number to report a violent domestic disturbance at the end of the hall on the top floor, a single, quiet action that would completely shatter the gang's plan of an undiscovered crime. The response from the Ottawa Police Department was swift but cautious, as the dispatcher recognized the address as a known high-density area where low-level drug transactions were common, prompting them to dispatch 2 patrol cars to investigate the complaint. The officers arrived at the complex with their sirens silent and their emergency lights turned off, their cruisers gliding through the thick, white fog like ghosts before parking at the edge of the dark lot. They entered the building through the rear security door, which had been left propped open with a small piece of wood by the gang members to facilitate their eventual escape with the body. As the 2 officers climbed the concrete stairwell, their hands resting instinctively on the grips of their sidearms, the heavy, industrial smell of the building gave way to an unnatural, absolute silence on the 3rd floor, a quiet that felt too deliberate for a Wednesday night. They navigated the long, dimly lit hallway, their boots making no sound on the worn carpet, until they reached the door at the very end of the hall, where a faint, thin line of yellow light escaped from beneath the frame. As the lead officer leaned his ear closer to the wooden door, he didn't hear the sounds of a typical neighborhood dispute. Instead, he caught the distinct, metallic rattle of a firearm slide being cycled and the low, urgent whispering of multiple male voices discussing the weight of a body. Recognizing that they were dealing with a high-risk, ongoing criminal situation rather than a simple noise complaint, the officers bypassed the standard procedure of knocking and announcing their presence. Knowing that every second could mean the difference between life and death for whoever was inside. With a synchronized nod, the larger officer threw his entire body weight against the lock, the wood splintering with a deafening crash as the door burst inward, slamming against the interior wall and exposing the horror of the apartment to the bright flashlights of the law. The sudden intrusion exploded the room into chaos, the beam of the officer's light cutting through the thick layer of cigarette smoke to reveal a landscape that resembled a nightmare. The officers were met with the sight of multiple men freezing in place, their faces pale with shock as they realized their absolute isolation had been broken by the authority of the state. On the floor of the living room, 3 young bodies lay bound and blindfolded, their skin white with terror, the thin wires around their necks glinting in the flashlight beams as they trembled against the linoleum. The officers did not hesitate, drawing their service weapons and barking commands with a thunderous authority that echoed through the small apartment, ordering every occupant to get on the ground with their hands behind their heads. Several of the younger gang members immediately collapsed to their knees, their bravado evaporating the moment they looked down the barrel of a police-issue weapon, while the older leaders attempted to move toward the back windows. Only to find their path blocked by the second officer who had already secured the perimeter of the room. Within minutes, backup units arrived, the building surrounded by flashing red and blue lights that pierced the thick Ottawa fog, signaling the total collapse of the Ace Crew's stronghold. As the suspects were handcuffed and led down the stairs in a grim, silent procession, the detectives from the Major Crimes Unit arrived to take control of the scene, stepping into an environment that would become one of the most thoroughly documented crime scenes in the city's history. The initial walkthrough revealed the meticulous preparation that had gone into the crime, with the forensic team immediately identifying the heavy blankets nailed over the windows and the extensive use of black plastic bags and duct tape in the storage closet, which spoke volumes about the premeditated nature of the violence. When the investigators entered the master bedroom, the true tragedy of the night was laid bare. They found the tightly wrapped, plastic-covered form of Sylvain Leduc, his life stolen by a system of violence he had no part in creating. The forensic technicians began their slow, painstaking work under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, photographing the position of the body, collecting the discarded rolls of tape, and dusting every surface for the latent fingerprints that would eventually link each member of the Ace Crew to the destruction of an innocent life. The immediate aftermath of the raid on the third-floor apartment plunged the Ottawa Major Crimes Unit into a complex, high-stakes investigation that quickly exposed the systemic rot of the city's criminal underbelly. In the first 48 hours, the police station was a hive of frantic activity, with detectives working in shifts around the clock, their desks piled high with heavy manila folders, forensic evidence logs, and overlapping transcripts of initial interviews. 11 individuals had been detained at the scene, a mixture of hardened street enforcers, low-level drug runners, and teenage associates who had looked to the ACE crew for a sense of identity. However, securing an apartment full of suspects did not automatically translate into a clear-cut case of first-degree murder, as the investigators were immediately met with a thick, unyielding wall of silence that the gang had spent years cultivating through intimidation and fear. The older, seasoned members of the cartel sat in the interrogation rooms with their arms crossed, their expressions vacant and unbothered, answering every pointed question with cold, monosyllabic denials or a flat refusal to speak without their defense attorneys present. They knew the rules of the street, understanding that the state had to prove who delivered the fatal blows, and as long as everyone kept their mouths shut, the collective guilt could be diluted in a sea of reasonable doubt. This wall of non-cooperation created an immediate crisis for the lead detectives, who found themselves navigating an intricate labyrinth of conflicting stories and dead ends during the first week of the investigation. While the physical evidence clearly established that a horrific crime had taken place within the apartment, the challenge lay in attributing specific actions to specific individuals in a room that had been occupied by over a dozen people. The initial forensic reports confirmed that Sylvain Leduc had died from massive internal trauma caused by multiple blunt force injuries, but the weapons used, including the bang sung and heavy boots, left generic marks that could belong to anyone in the room. Detectives attempted to play the suspects against one another, isolating the younger, more vulnerable teens in separate interview rooms, hoping that the threat of a life sentence would crack their loyalty to the ACE crew. But the shadow of the gang's leadership extended deep into the cell blocks. Whispered threats in the holding areas and meaningful glances exchanged in the hallways were enough to keep the younger boys paralyzed with fear. Choosing to risk a prison sentence rather than the certain death that awaited a street informant. As the days bled into weeks, the investigation hit a frustrating plateau, with several promising leads evaporating into thin air as the outer circle of the ACE crew actively worked to scrub the city of corroborating evidence. Detectives launched a series of coordinated raids on known gang safehouses across Vonia and the West End, looking for the white cargo van's registration history and the origin of the industrial wire used to bind the victims. However, they consistently found themselves one step behind, arriving at locations only to find empty apartments, burnt-out vehicles, and witnesses who suddenly suffered from total amnesia when questioned about the events of October 25. The local community, terrified of being targeted by the remaining members of the cartel, locked their doors and refused to cooperate, turning a blind eye to the photographs of suspects shown to them by desperate investigators. This widespread, paralyzing fear created a protective bubble around the perpetrators, threatening to turn the brutal murder of an innocent 17-year-old boy into another unsolved statistic in the city's gang ledger. The emotional weight of this deadlock took a heavy toll on the Leduc family and the investigative team, as the lack of immediate progress felt like a secondary assault on Sylvain's memory. The detectives, driven by the memory of the 3 traumatized children they had rescued from the linoleum floor, refused to let the case go cold. Spending their nights re-examining the physical layout of the crime scene and searching for the one microscopic detail that the killers might have overlooked in their arrogance. They meticulously reviewed the background of every single person arrested that night, searching for past rivalries, financial vulnerabilities, or familial connections that could be used as a wedge to break the conspiracy of silence. Every phone log from the apartment, every scrap of paper found in the pockets of the suspects, and every piece of silver duct tape was subjected to advanced forensic scrutiny, as the team knew that their only hope of breaking the case lay in finding a piece of objective, undeniable truth that no gang code could silence. The turning point in the investigation did not come from a sudden confession or a change of heart by the seasoned members of the ACE crew, but from the painstaking, undeniable precision of forensic science and the vulnerability of the youngest accomplice. Weeks into the deadlock, the forensic laboratory returned a definitive report on the role of silver duct tape recovered from the storage closet, the very tape used to seal the plastic wrapping around Sylvain Leduc's body. Utilizing advanced adhesive analysis and specialized light sources, technicians managed to isolate a partial fingerprint left on the sticky interior side of the tape, a place where the killer had mistakenly touched the roll while ripping a strip with his bare hands. The print did not belong to the gang's leadership, but to a 16-year-old low-level associate who had been present in the apartment on the night of the murder. Confronted with this unassailable physical evidence in a dark interrogation room, the teenager's composure completely dissolved, the reality of a first-degree murder charge and a lifetime behind bars shattering his allegiance to the cartel. Under the gentle but firm questioning of the lead detective, the young accomplice began to weep, his voice trembling as he detailed the exact timeline of the night and broke the conspiracy of silence that had protected the gang for weeks. He described the precise hierarchy of the room, identifying who had given the orders to blindfold the victims, who had prepared the plastic bags, and most importantly, which specific members had entered the master bedroom to deliver the fatal blows to Sylvain. This testimony provided the structural skeleton that the prosecution desperately needed, transforming a room full of silent suspects into a clearly defined network of principals and co-conspirators. The detective sat quietly, recording every name and action, knowing that the wall of intimidation erected by the Ace crew had finally cracked from the inside, leaving the leadership exposed to the full weight of the Canadian justice system. Armed with this insider account, investigators were able to re-examine the physical evidence with a new lens, finding corroborating microtraces that aligned perfectly with the teenager's confession. Fiber analysis from the heavy boots of the main perpetrators revealed microscopic traces of the apartment's master bedroom carpet mixed with the victim's blood, creating an unbroken physical link that no defense attorney could explain away as mere presence at the scene. The Crown prosecutors immediately began structuring a massive, multi-defendant case, utilizing the young accomplice's formal statement as the cornerstone of an indictment that would target the Ace crew not just as individual criminals, but as a coordinated enterprise capable of premeditated murder. The breakthrough brought a somber sense of relief to the Major Crimes Unit, a validation of their relentless refusal to let the case go cold, and set the stage for a judicial confrontation that would transpire in front of a grieving family and a shocked city. The judicial proceedings following the brutal murder of Alain Sylvain Leduc began in the spring of 1996, transforming the Ottawa courthouse into a theatre of intense emotional pain and stark legal confrontation that would transpire over 18 grueling months. The courtroom was packed to capacity every single day, with members of the public, journalists, and a massive contingent of police officers filling the benches, all drawn by the sheer gravity and unmitigated cruelty of the crime. On one side of the aisle sat the Leduc family, anchored by Sylvain's grandmother, Therese McQuaig, their faces etched with a profound, unyielding sorrow that had not diminished since that terrible night in October. On the other side, isolated in a heavily guarded glass dock, sat the members of the Ace crew, their physical presence in the courtroom providing a chilling reminder of the street culture that had claimed an innocent life. Throughout the lengthy trial, the defendants showed an absolute, sociopathic lack of remorse that shocked even the seasoned court officials, as they frequently smirked, whispered jokes to one another, and exchanged arrogant glances with their associates in the gallery. Completely indifferent to the agonizing pain of the family sitting just meters away. The Crown prosecutors built their case with a methodical, unassailable precision, utilizing a mountain of physical evidence and the devastating testimony of the survivors to recreate the horror of the third-floor apartment for the jury. The young cousin, though visibly trembling and weeping, took the stand to recount the terrifying sequence of events from the initial home invasion to the moment the police kicked down the door, her voice cracking as she described Sylvain's desperate attempts to protect her. The prosecution presented the silver duct tape bearing the partial fingerprint, the blood-stained boots of the attackers, and the detailed forensic autopsy reports that catalogued the horrific extent of the internal trauma inflicted upon the 17-year-old boy. The defense team attempted to mud public perception by shifting blame among the 11 co-conspirators, arguing that the chaos of the room made it impossible to determine who delivered the definitive fatal blows. But the collective accountability established by the premeditated preparations of the crime scene left no room for legal evasion. When the jury finally returned after days of tense deliberation, the courtroom was gripped by a suffocating silence as the verdicts were read aloud one by one, signaling a total victory for the justice system and a definitive blow against the Ace crew. The core members who had entered the master bedroom and directly participated in the systematic beating were found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, an offense that carried an automatic sentence of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The remaining co-conspirators, including those who had nailed the blankets over the windows and prepared the industrial garbage bags, were convicted of manslaughter, kidnapping, and aggravated assault, receiving substantial prison terms that effectively dismantled the leadership structure of the gang. As the sentences were handed down, the judge reprimanded the defendants for their grotesque lack of humanity, noting that their actions represented the worst elements of human depravity and that society required total protection from their presence. The finality of the gavels striking the wood marked the end of a long legal battle, but for the Leduc family, the closing of the trial was merely the beginning of a lifelong journey through a landscape permanently altered by the loss of their gentle boy. The echoes of the final gavels hitting the wood in the Ottawa courtroom eventually faded, but the hollow space left in the wake of Sylvain Leduc's murder remained an open wound that would never fully heal for those who loved him. The true tragedy of a life taken by senseless violence does not end when the prison doors lock behind the perpetrators, it simply transforms into a quiet, permanent grief that the survivors must carry through every ordinary day that follows. For the Leduc family, the changing of the seasons and the passing of holidays would always be marked by an empty chair and the painful memory of a gentle, 17-year-old boy whose future was stolen in a single night of calculated cruelty. The modest suburban home that had once been a sanctuary of warmth and laughter was forever altered, its walls carrying the invisible weight of the night the front door turned without a knock, a reminder of how quickly innocence can be shattered by a world that knows no mercy. Sylvain's story, however, did not conclude as merely a grim chapter in the city's criminal history, because out of the depths of this absolute despair emerged a powerful legacy of resilience and resistance led by his grandmother, Therese McQuaig. Refusing to let her grandson's memory be buried beneath the clinical details of a police file or forgotten in the archives of a courthouse, she channeled her overwhelming grief into a fierce, lifelong campaign for judicial reform across Canada. She became a tireless voice for the rights of victims and their families, walking the corridors of power in Ottawa and standing before the parliamentary committees on justice and human rights to demand that the legal system reflect the true gravity of violent crimes. Her advocacy fought against the systemic leniency that often allowed violent offenders and organized gang members to receive early parole or reduced sentences, arguing with the raw authority of a grieving matriarch that a society which fails to protect its innocent children loses its moral compass. Through her efforts, Sylvain's name became synonymous not just with the horror of gang violence, but with a structural awakening that forced a nation to re-examine how it treats the victims left behind in the wake of tragedy. The final lesson of the Sylvain Leduc case extends far beyond the borders of Ottawa or the specific criminality of the Ace crew. It stands as a somber, universal reminder of the profound interconnectedness of human choices and the heavy price paid when a society allows vulnerable youth to slip into the margins of neglect. It forces us to look beneath the pristine facades of our cities and confront the dark subcultures that grow when isolation and systemic failure take root, recognizing that the violence which breeds in the shadows will eventually bleed into the light. Sylvain was a boy who had no part in the underworld, an absolute bystander whose only crime was possessing a heart large enough to offer shelter to a cousin fleeing from wolves, a profound act of family loyalty that ultimately cost him everything. As we look back at the quiet autumn fog that rolled into Ottawa on October 25, 1995, we are left with the enduring image of a young man who, in the face of absolute terror, chose to stand as a protector for the innocent children behind him. A final act of courage that shines as a beacon of pure humanity against the deep, remorseless darkness that tried to consume him. The structural completion of this narrative matrix brings us to the final, necessary layer of reflection, a space where the clinical details of the true crime genre must give way to a deeper philosophical accounting of what it means to remember. When the true crime genre is stripped of its sensationalism and its forensic jargon, we are left with a fundamental human obligation, the duty to ensure that an innocent life is not forgotten, and that the narrative does not belong solely to the perpetrators who inflicted the trauma. The story of Alain Sylvain Leduc is a profound testament to the fact that the ripple effects of organized criminality do not stop at the boundaries of the underworld, they cascade outward, colliding with the lives of ordinary citizens who live with their doors unlocked and their hearts open. Sylvain's choices on that freezing, fog-shrouded night in October 1995 were not defined by tactical calculations or a desire for martyrdom, but by a pure, uncorrupted sense of familial duty that forced him to stand as a human shield between three helpless children and a wolf pack that had abandoned its humanity. In those final, agonizing hours inside the third-floor apartment, when the world outside was completely oblivious to his suffering, this 17-year-old boy displayed a level of moral fortitude that completely eclipsed the collective bravado of the 11 individuals who sought to break him. To look back at this case from the vantage point of decades is to recognize that justice is a multi-layered construct, one that begins in the courtroom with the striking of a gavel but must ultimately be sustained through structural change and collective memory. The sentences handed down to the ACE crew effectively neutralized a specific cell of urban terror, but the deeper victory belonged to Therese McQuaig and the Leduc family, who refused to let Sylvain's name become a footnote in Ottawa's municipal archives. By carrying their grief directly into the halls of Parliament, they transformed an act of senseless street violence into a catalyst for national legal evolution, ensuring that future victims of organized, premeditated crime would be met with a justice system that prioritizes their protection over the rehabilitation of remorseless offenders. This narrative serves as a stark, necessary reminder for any modern society that the health of a community cannot be measured solely by its pristine suburbs and economic prosperity, but by its willingness to confront the systemic fractures where disillusionment and violence take root. Sylvain Leduc's life was short, a blank canvas of potential cut down by the coldest variation of human malice, but his legacy remains an unyielding beacon of light, a reminder that even in the absolute heart of darkness, the simple, quiet courage of a good son can create an echo that refuses to die. The final analysis of this historic tragedy requires us to confront the structural failure of an urban environment that allowed a predatory entity like the ACE crew to operate with such absolute arrogance within a modern capital city. When we dissect the geography of this crime, moving from the quiet, unsuspecting suburban street where Sylvain lived to the drab, concrete apartment complex that served as his execution chamber, we are mapping the invisible lines of social neglect that exist in every metropolitan center. The members of the cartel did not materialize from a vacuum. They were the products of a localized ecosystem where low-level criminality had been permitted to fester, ignored by a broader populace that believed violence was something that only happened to people who chose to live on the edge. This collective blind spot is what gave the gang their sense of total invincibility, a toxic belief that they could cross the city, breach a peaceful home, and carry out a calculated execution without the law ever catching up to their footsteps. The intervention of the elderly neighbor who noticed the unusual vibrations through his ceiling remains the pivotal hinge of this entire saga, a sharp reminder that the ultimate defense against urban rot is not a more heavily armed police force, but a community where people still choose to look out for one another and refuse to remain silent in the presence of suffering. The legacy of Alain Sylvain Leduc is fundamentally a narrative about the endurance of innocence over the hollow performance of street dominance that defines the gang lifestyle. The young men who locked themselves in that master bedroom to destroy a 17-year-old boy believed they were performing an act of strength, a demonstration of the gang's absolute sovereignty over its members and its territory. In reality, their actions revealed a profound, pathetic cowardice, an inability to function outside of a pack, a reliance on ropes and wires to neutralize a single defenseless teenager, and a total collapse of their bravado the moment they were forced to look down the barrels of the responding officers' weapons. Sylvain, conversely, possessed a quiet, solitary strength that required no patch, no weapon, and no collective validation. His authority came from his integrity, an unyielding decision to protect his family that he maintained until his heart stopped beating. As the decades pass and the names of his attackers fade into the sterile registry of the Canadian federal prison system, Sylvain's memory continues to carry a profound weight, forcing every listener who encounters his story to evaluate their own commitment to the people they love and the communities they inhabit. The broader cultural significance of the Sylvain Leduc tragedy lies in how it systematically shattered the comfortable myths that middle-class North American communities constructed around themselves during the closing decade of the 20th century. For generations, the sprawling suburban developments surrounding major metropolitan areas were marketed as impenetrable safe havens, geographic zones where the anxieties of the inner city could be entirely filtered out by manicured lawns, top-tier school districts, and an unspoken social contract of collective isolation. The sudden, violent penetration of this domestic sanctuary by the ACE crew served as a catastrophic revelation that the lines separating safety from absolute peril are entirely illusory, drawn on a map but easily erased by individuals who refuse to recognize the boundaries of civilized society. The Leduc family did not invite the chaos into their living room through negligence or illicit associations. They were targeted because they possessed the simple, decent human instinct to provide shelter to a vulnerable child who was running from a lifetime of abuse and exploitation. This reality forces a profound and unsettling re-examination of our collective responsibility toward our neighbors, demonstrating that absolute neutrality is an unachievable luxury in an interconnected world where the darkness festering in one corner of a city will inevitably find a vehicle to transport itself into the light of another. Ultimately, the preservation of Sylvain's memory serves as an ongoing critique of a criminal justice philosophy that prioritizes the abstract rehabilitation of career offenders over the very real, generational trauma inflicted upon the victims left behind in their wake. When Therese McQuaig stood before the legislative bodies of Canada, she was not merely asking for a harsher penal code out of a desire for primitive vengeance, she was demanding a profound philosophical realignment that forces the state to recognize the permanent, unalterable nature of a life taken by premeditated violence. A prison sentence of 25 years possesses a definitive end date, a moment where the perpetrators can theoretically step back into the sun and attempt to rebuild their existences, whereas the sentence handed down to the Leduc family is an infinite, daily confrontation with an empty chair that stretches across generations. By ensuring that Sylvain's name remains a central pillar of the ongoing dialogue surrounding victims' rights, his family transformed his final, terrifying moments into a permanent shield for future generations, ensuring that his quiet heroism continues to protect the innocent long after the physical structures of the Ottawa apartment complex have turned to dust. The internal structural dynamics of the Ottawa underworld underwent a violent, permanent realignment in the years following the total dismantle of the ACE crew, proving that the destruction of Sylvain Leduc was not just a moral catastrophe but a strategic suicide for the cartel. Criminal syndicates thrive on a delicate balance of terror and invisibility, operating under a tacit assumption that as long as their violence remains contained within their own ranks, the broader mechanisms of the state will treat them as a secondary priority. By crossing the threshold of a respectable suburban home and executing an innocent teenage bystander with such industrialized cruelty, the leadership of the ACE crew dissolved that boundary, forcing the community and the municipal government to launch an unprecedented total war against their operations. The massive police presence, the continuous media exposure, and the intense community surveillance that followed the trial made the city entirely inhospitable to their survival, drying up their financial networks and driving their remaining street enforcers into permanent hiding or internal betrayal. The swift, total evaporation of the gang from the streets of Vonia stands as a historical lesson in the self-destructive nature of unmitigated hubris, proving that when a criminal enterprise loses its baseline understanding of human empathy, it inevitably constructs the apparatus of its own obliteration. On a deeper psychological level, this case forces an examination of the terrifying phenomenon of collective moral alignment, wherein ordinary human beings can become active participants in an atrocity when insulated by the identity of a group. The 11 individuals who gathered in that third-floor apartment were not all born sociopaths or calculating monsters. Many were young, impressionable teenagers who had drifted into the orbit of the ACE crew out of a basic human need for structure, security, and social validation. Yet, within the suffocating atmosphere of that taped-up room, surrounded by the physical symbols of their allegiance and the demands of their leaders, their individual moral agency was systematically erased, replaced by a predatory tribalism that viewed the torment of an innocent boy as a test of loyalty. This systematic degradation of individual conscience is the true currency of gang culture, a process that requires its members to continuously sacrifice their own humanity in exchange for the cheap, temporary status of the street. By remembering the details of Sylvain's final hours, we are not merely documenting a historic crime, we are analyzing the specific sociological mechanisms that allow ordinary youths to become instruments of absolute depravity. A reminder that the ultimate barrier against societal breakdown is the fierce preservation of individual accountability over the seductive, destructive pull of the collective. The historical trajectory of the Ottawa Community post-1995 reveals that the trauma inflicted upon the city by the ACE crew did not simply vanish with the incarceration of its leaders, but instead woven itself into the very fabric of local urban development and community policing. In the neighborhoods that had been most heavily targeted by the gang's predatory recruitment, a profound shift occurred as grassroots organizations, churches, and ordinary citizens realized that passive reliance on institutional authorities was no longer sufficient to guarantee the safety of their youth. The memory of Sylvain Leduc became a rallying cry for the creation of safe houses, after-school mentoring initiatives, and youth outreach programs designed specifically to intercept vulnerable teenagers before they could be ensnared by the false promises of the street. These community-led interventions sought to strip away the social isolation that gangs like the ACE crew systematically exploited, offering young people genuine avenues of belonging, education, and economic mobility that did not require the surrender of their moral agency. This slow, multi-generational reconstruction of the city's social fabric stands as a living monument to Sylvain's legacy, proving that the ultimate antidote to systemic violence is a deliberate, unyielding investment in the human capital of our communities. Furthermore, the deep psychological survival of the remaining victims who were rescued from that third-floor apartment offers an unvarnished look at the realities of complex post-traumatic stress and the grueling path toward emotional reclamation. For the young cousin, the niece, and Sylvain's teenage friend, the physical rescue by the Ottawa police was not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of an internal struggle against the memories of the darkness, the ropes, and the suffocating terror of the wire around their necks. The survival guilt they carried, knowing that Sylvain had borne the absolute brunt of the gang's malice so that they might live, became a heavy mantle that shaped the trajectory of their adult lives, forcing them to find meaning in a survival that had been bought at such a catastrophic cost. Their ability to move forward, to build families, pursue careers, and maintain their humanity despite having looked directly into the abyss of human depravity, is a quiet victory over the ACE crew's legacy of destruction. By continuing to exist, to heal, and to speak the truth, they ensure that the final word on that terrible October night is not one of victimization, but of an enduring, unbreakable resilience that the darkness could never completely extinguish. The philosophical implications of the Sylvain Leduc case force a modern audience to reckon with the concept of the absolute bystander and the terrifying randomness of predatory violence. In many criminal narratives, there is a tangible thread of causality that the human mind can latch onto in an attempt to make sense of the tragedy, a historical dispute, a financial betrayal, or a conscious decision to engage with dangerous individuals. But in the case of this 17-year-old boy, that comforting illusion of causality is entirely stripped away, leaving behind the raw, unvarnished reality of a completely innocent soul caught in the blind crosshairs of an urban syndicate. Sylvain did not make a mistake, he did not compromise his morals, and he did not stray into the wrong neighborhoods. He was executed within the borders of his own family's sanctuary simply because his existence intersected with a gang's obsessive need to enforce its territorial dominance. This random malice is what makes the case so deeply unsettling to the collective psyche, as it destroys the psychological defense mechanism that allows us to believe we can control our own safety through good behavior and careful choices. It forces us to acknowledge that as long as violent subcultures are permitted to grow unchecked within our cities, every home remains structurally vulnerable, and every innocent life remains a potential casualty of a war they did not choose to fight. To truly honor the space that Sylvain Leduc occupied in the world, we must look beyond the institutional responses of the state and focus on the quiet, enduring dignity of a family that refused to let their love be conquered by terror. The true measure of a society's moral health is found in how it responds to its deepest wounds, and the Leduc family chose a path of fierce, constructive remembrance that turned their private nightmare into a public shield for the defenseless. Long after the true crime podcasts have moved on to other mysteries and the newspaper ink has faded into historical archives, the legacy of that gentle giant lives on in every piece of legislation that protects a victim's rights and every community program that pulls a vulnerable child away from the abyss of the streets. Sylvain's final act on this earth was not an act of defeat, but an act of supreme, protective love, a conscious decision to absorb the blows of the world so that those smaller than him could survive to see the morning sun. In a universe that often seems indifferent to the suffering of the innocent, that young man's choice remains a permanent defiance against the darkness, a proof that the human capacity for goodness can never be truly extinguished by the forces of malice. No matter how heavy the night or how thick the fog. The structural decay of the ACE crew following the public outrage of 1995 provides a crucial case study in the ultimate futility of criminal networks that rely on unmitigated terror to sustain their existence. For years, the leadership of this syndicate operated under the delusion that their willingness to execute extreme violence made them invincible, creating an artificial kingdom built on the silence of intimidated witnesses and the compliance of compromised neighborhoods. However, the systematic torture and murder of Sylvain Leduc crossed an invisible but definitive moral boundary within the community, shifting public sentiment from passive fear to active hostility. When ordinary citizens saw that a completely innocent 17-year-old boy could be dragged from his home and executed in an industrialized slaughterhouse, the collective resistance materialized in ways the gang could not predict or control. Informants who had previously remained silent out of self-preservation began coming forward. Real estate owners refused to rent apartments to known associates of the cartel. And the financial lifelines that sustained their operations were systematically severed by targeted corporate and legal investigations. This multi-layered societal rejection demonstrates that a criminal organization's true vulnerability lies not in its physical conflicts with law enforcement, but in the total loss of its baseline social camouflage, proving that when the moral threshold of a community is breached, the apparatus of the street inevitably collapses under the weight of its own depravity. On a deeper institutional level, the case became a defining turning point for the Ottawa Police Service, forcing a complete overhaul of how municipal law enforcement handles high-density gang tracking and interprovincial criminal syndicates. Prior to the Leduc tragedy, gang violence was often treated as a localized issue, a series of isolated turf wars that could be managed through traditional reactive policing methods and routine street patrols. The meticulous preparation discovered inside that third-floor apartment, the black garbage bags, the secured windows, the systematic use of industrial wire, shattered this institutional complacency, revealing a level of calculated premeditation that resembled international cartel operations rather than disorganized street crime. In response, the Major Crimes Unit established dedicated anti-gang task forces that prioritized intelligence-led policing, wiretapping networks, and the proactive disruption of recruitment pipelines in vulnerable high schools. This institutional awakening shifted the focus from merely reacting to the bodies left in the streets to dismantling the financial and psychological structures that allowed these gangs to recruit children in the first place. Sylvain Leduc's tragic death ultimately forced a modernization of municipal justice, leaving behind a legacy where the state can no longer afford to ignore the gathering shadows until they have already claimed the lives of the innocent. The internal disintegration of the individuals who composed the ACE crew in the decades spent inside maximum security federal institutions offers a chilling postscript to the illusion of power that drove their actions on October 25, 1995. When the heavy cell doors locked behind the core perpetrators, separating them permanently from the street culture that had validated their cruelty, the artificial status symbols of the gang vanished, leaving them face to face with the raw reality of their own actions. Within the brutal, isolated environment of the Canadian penitentiary system, where reputation is continuously tested and the collective protection of a street crew is severely diluted, many of these men found themselves targets of the very same systemic violence they had once inflicted upon others. Prison records and subsequent parole hearing transcripts over the years reveal a pattern of psychological decay, where the arrogant grins displayed during the trial slowly mutated into hollow expressions of institutionalization and deep, unresolvable paranoia. Some attempted to maintain their criminal alliances behind bars, only to find that the currency of the street had no value in a world governed by long-term survival, leading to violent internal conflicts and permanent segregation from the general inmate population. This slow, agonizing erosion of their identities stands as a grim validation of the law of consequences, a proof that the hollow kingdom they attempted to build on the blood of an innocent teenager was nothing more than a direct path to their own psychological and social annihilation. Simultaneously, the enduring impact of the case on the legal landscape of Canada can be traced through the specific modifications made to the Youth Criminal Justice Act and the criteria used to try young offenders as adults in cases of extreme premeditated violence. The fact that several of the individuals inside that third-floor apartment were under the age of 18 created a profound crisis within the justice system. As defense attorneys aggressively leveraged their clients' youth to seek reduced sentences and shield them from the full weight of a first-degree murder conviction. The public outrage generated by the chilling details of the crime, the methodical taping of the walls, the careful deployment of the wire restraints forced lawmakers to recognize that chronological age could no longer be used as an automatic shield for individuals who displayed an adult capacity for calculated, industrialized cruelty. Therese McQuaig's continuous testimony before parliamentary committees served as the emotional and moral engine for this legislative shift, ensuring that the legal system evolved to prioritize the protection of society and the rights of victims over the abstract leniency historically afforded to violent juvenile offenders. By rewriting these boundaries, the Canadian state acknowledged that the nature of an act must dictate its consequences, establishing a legal precedent where the memory of Sylvain Leduc continues to serve as an unyielding barrier against the exploitation of judicial loopholes by the next generation of urban predators. The sociological impact of this tragedy extends deep into the historical evolution of victim advocacy, marking a fundamental transition from private grief to institutionalized power within the Canadian legal framework. Prior to the relentless campaign mounted by Therese McQuaig, the families of homicide victims were often treated as secondary entities by the court system, passive observers in a bureaucratic process that viewed the crime primarily as an offense against the state rather than a catastrophic violation of a specific human collective. The Leduc family, through their refusal to remain silent or hidden behind the statistics of municipal crime, forced a profound cultural shift that integrated the victim impact statement into the foundational core of sentencing hearings, ensuring that the human cost of violence can never be completely scrubbed from the legal record. This institutionalization of grief changed the atmosphere of the modern courtroom, stripping away the sterile detachment that defense teams historically used to insulate their clients from the emotional consequences of their depravity. When judges sit to determine the fate of violent offenders today, they are forced to look directly into the eyes of the mothers, fathers, and grandmothers whose lives have been permanently fractured, making the reality of the empty chair a structural component of the state's calculus of punishment. Furthermore, the case remains an essential diagnostic tool for criminologists and social psychologists studying the phenomenon of urban pack behavior and the total erosion of individual empathy under the pressure of criminal peer structures. The meticulous division of labor discovered within that third-floor apartment, where some individuals prepared the room, others controlled the hostages, and a specific subgroup executed the violence, reveals how organized gangs use compartmentalization to dilute the individual guilt of their members. By breaking a monstrous act down into smaller, technical tasks, the leadership of the ACE crew allowed young associates to participate in a first-degree murder while convincing themselves that they were merely following protocol or performing routine logistics. This psychological insulation is the true danger of urban syndicates, a mechanism that can transform an ordinary teenager into an instrument of absolute savagery within the span of a single evening. By continuously analyzing the transcripts and forensic maps of October 25, 1995, modern research institutions are able to develop targeted counter-intervention strategies that focus on breaking this collective psychological alignment before it can manifest in bloodshed, transforming the tragic sacrifice of Sylvain Leduc into a source of knowledge that protects the youth of tomorrow from the seductive, lethal trap of the pack. The deep theological and existential questions raised by the sacrifice of Sylvain Leduc continue to resonate within the collective memory of Ottawa, serving as a stark meditation on the nature of pure good and unmitigated evil within the human condition. In a contemporary culture that often reduces human behavior to socio-economic variables, psychological diagnoses, or environmental conditioning, this case stands as an unyielding reminder that there are moments where individuals must make a definitive, absolute choice between darkness and light. Sylvain did not possess the tactical training of a soldier or the political power of a lawmaker, yet when he was thrust into a scenario of absolute terror, his baseline instinct was not self-preservation, but the active preservation of the vulnerable children trapped behind him. This transcendent act of love, executed in a cold, concrete apartment room under the weight of severe physical trauma, completely destabilizes the nihilistic worldview of the street cartel, proving that the capacity for human nobility cannot be crushed by the machinery of intimidation. By absorbing the physical malice of the Ace crew, Sylvain effectively halted the cycle of violence that threatened to consume his entire family that night, creating a boundary that the darkness could touch but could never truly cross. As the physical markers of the 1995 tragedy fade as the apartment complex undergoes renovation, the old police logs are digitized into cold data servers, and the generation that witnessed the trial grows old. The spiritual legacy of the event demands a continuous commitment to truth over comfort. The story of Sylvain Leduc must never be allowed to settle into the passive archive of historical true crime entertainment, because its lessons are living obligations that require us to actively monitor the safety and moral health of our own immediate environments. It challenges every individual to reject the bystander apathy that allows predatory subcultures to take root in the margins of our cities, reminding us that our personal safety is inextricably bound to the protection of the weakest members of our communities. The enduring image of the quiet autumn fog rolling over the capital city on that fateful night serves as a permanent canvas of remembrance, a reminder that while the shadows of human malice will always seek to expand their territory, they are ultimately powerless against the eternal quiet light of a single soul that chooses to stand for love, integrity, and the ultimate defense of innocence.